बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद पंडित जी। समग्र वातावरण गोविंदमय हो गया। We thank Padma Vibhushan Pandit Jasraj ji and Durga Jasraj ji for this wonderful, soulful experience. That was Govinda Damodar Madhave ji. We now invite on the dais our dignitaries, Honorable Union Finance Minister Shri Arun Jaitley ji, Honorable Chief Minister of Gujarat Srimati Anandiben Patel, we also invite on the dais President World Bank Mr. Jim Yong Kim, we take this opportunity to welcome our dignitaries on the dais. We invite Honorable Finance Minister Gujarat Shri Saurabhbhai Patel to welcome Honorable Minister Shri Arun Jaitley ji. And we request Chief Minister Gujarat Shri D.J. Pandian to welcome Honorable Chief Minister of Gujarat Srimati Anandiben Patel. We request Commissioner Geology and Mines Mr. Natarajan to welcome Mr. Jim Yong Kim, President World Bank. The story of India's growth is the story of two offices, the Prime Ministers and the Finance Ministers. When they work well together with intelligence and passion, good things, even great things happen in our country. In Honorable Minister Arun Jaitley, Prime Minister Shri Modi ji seems to have found the right partner. His intelligence, his passion and energy in office have been a revelation. We are fortunate to have with us today to conduct a conversation with you about transforming India. He will follow his opening remarks with a series of questions that you will have to answer. Prepare yourselves and please join me in welcoming India's Finance Minister, Mr. Arun Jaitley.
Honorable Chief Minister for Gujarat, Srimati Anandiben Patel. President of the World Bank, Mr. Jim Yong Kim, ladies and gentlemen, we've just heard for the last 30 minutes one of the most outstanding voices of India in Pandit Jasraj. Well, it will be a greater music to our ears if the world starts seeing India entirely differently from what it has in the last few years. Things are changing, and things are changing very rapidly. We are here in the state of Gujarat, where we see some of the most progressive steps taken by the government here. When the first Vibrant Gujarat conference was held in the year 2003, I was a Commerce and Industry Minister in Mr. Vajpayee's government. And I had come to attend that conference in a moderately sized auditorium in the city of Ahmedabad. That's entirely the number of delegates who had come. But then Gujarat was fortunate to have a Chief Minister in Shri Narendra Modi at that time, who doggedly and in a single-minded pursuit pushed for changes, improvements, built an infrastructure, and more important, he built the credibility of a decision-making process in the state. And 6 conferences later, when we have the 7th edition of the Vibrant Gujarat Summit, this summit has become a principal opportunity for heads of government, representatives of governments, ministers, policy makers, global policy makers, heads of companies and corporations, all assembling together, and in order to discuss how the economy of this region is to be built up. And this has resulted in action also. Vibrant Gujarat has also been a trendsetter in many ways. This week, this is the second such conference that I am attending. The first was held earlier this week in West Bengal. And I must confess that despite political and ideological differences, as India's Finance Minister, I am enthused by the fact that at these conferences, the language, the idiom, the policy which chief ministers and state governments have started talking about is a great indication of the change which is likely to happen. What was Gujarat's good fortune in 2003 when the first Vibrant Gujarat was held is now a great opportunity for the government of India that Shri Narendra Modi is now our Prime Minister. Very important changes have taken place. And the most important of them is itself a political change. The political change that took place in the middle of last year indicated that things are going to change in India. India has a government which has absolute clarity of policy. It has a leader who's decisive. I do believe that No finance minister can ever execute effective steps unless he has an unequivocal nod from the Prime Minister of the country. We have a clarity of policy. We have a decisive leader. We have a roadmap which is absolutely clear. And in the last 7 months, it's almost week after week that we are taking one step after the other. Each step is singularly in the same direction. We want to open the gates of investment. We want to expedite the decision-making process. We want to ease in the process of doing business in India. We want to signal to the world at large that here is a country which won't take years or decades in order to bring about a policy change. In fact, some of our criticism is not for taking or postponing decisions. An internal criticism is, why are you doing it at such a pace? Why don't you wait for a lethargic pace of events and legislations? Why are you doing it more hurriedly? India is getting impatient. We are conscious of that. And therefore, it is in this pursuit that the government of India today is acting. We have many progressive state governments like Gujarat, and which are setting the trend. We'd always said that India is a country which is federal in nature. It's a federation of states. And we've been speaking of cooperative federalism. Last week I mentioned that besides cooperative federalism, India is also a country where there is competitive federalism. In the world today, the investor is also the chooser. He chooses which country to invest in. He's also going to choose which of the Indian states to invest in. And therefore, if any of our regions has a reservation about a policy of the central government, we are going to leave them free not to execute that policy. But eventually history will judge as to whether they benefited or those who decided more progressive policies themselves have benefited. It's in this spirit that we are functioning. And this brief session is going to be one of the most important sessions of this vibrant Gujarat. We'll have the President of the World Bank speak to us later. We'll have the Secretary of State, the United States of America, Mr. John Kerry, speaking to us. And finally, we'll be addressed by the Prime Minister of India, Shri Narendra Modi. But before Mr. Kerry and Mr. Modi arrive, which should be in a little while from now, we decided to have an interactive session where a large number of you may have some suggestions to offer. Some may have some questions to ask. And therefore, this session has been planned in a manner that till Mr. Kerry and Mr. Modi arrive, I will probably be at the receiving end. And therefore, with these few words, I'll invite you to join us in this session. I have a list of names which has been given to me as to those who would like to make a brief intervention from the floor. But I'm quite willing to be flexible and not restrict myself to these names alone. And therefore, we can start whichever way any one of you decides to open with some of his comments. For questions, my only request would be to be brief so that we can accommodate as many of us in this interactive session. That's all I had to say as an opening comment. Thank you. In the list which has been given to me, if I see the serial numbers which have been given, if I just go by that, which has no particular method in it, Mr. Ron Somers, founder and CEO of the India First Group, United States, and thereafter Mr. Mukesh Ambani. If there's a microphone in the audience, please.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Just an idea. And this morning, we heard very eloquent presentations from indeed the President of the World Bank regarding the need to be switching over to more and more renewable energy. I think there was a very compelling argument made. We have Dr. R.K. Pachauri in the audience, a Nobel laureate, supporting the concern about climate change. It's a big issue. And here's the idea that I have. Right now, the Indian policy on defense offsets allows expenditures by defense companies selling equipment to India to be investing in civil aviation, homeland security, or defense. Could we not consider broadening the definition of defense offsets to include energy storage? Because without adequate energy storage, we will never be able to add renewable energy capacity to the extent that we all desire. In fact, I understand that in Tamil Nadu, we're beginning to back down wind energy because of lack of storage. Gujarat is embarking on a massive solar program. The national solar policy is one of the most ambitious in the world. Indeed, we need energy storage. Right now, sir, the industry is nascent. It's brand new. The Chinese, the Koreans, the Americans are just beginning. India could be a powerhouse, and they could unleash the defense offset money to finance an entire new industry that would be for India, but indeed for export for all of the world. Thank you, sir.
Mukesh ji.
I'd like to start off by congratulating the Finance Minister on moving fast. As you rightly said, India is impatient, and all the steps, whether by ordinances or by introducing the GST, have raised India's stature, not only among industry in India, but globally. So our warm congratulations. As I see the world, at the beginning of 2015, globally, there are fears of deflation. That is, growth doesn't exist, and the world sees India as a place of growth. Our inflation has come down substantially. With oil prices now down, they contribute also to reducing inflation. I'd just like to hear your views on interest rates and what can we do as industry to really stimulate growth, to take our growth up to the 7, 8, 9% and keep it there, and also meet the aspirations of the people in terms of more and more employment. That is the challenge before us, and in a world where most of the world worries about deflation, how can India differentiate itself by a low interest rate regime and by promoting growth? Any views and advice that you would have for industry would be very helpful.
It's a very pertinent question that you've asked. As far as we in the government are concerned, there are a series of steps which we have taken. There are some more steps which we do intend taking. But we are absolutely clear that coming months will have to witness an emphasis in three areas. We've rebuilt the credibility of our decision making. We are trying to make India as an attractive investment destination. Every step has to be in the direction, and not a single contrarian step, of incentivizing and encouraging both domestic and international investment. We'll be concentrating on manufacturing, and every policy, from our fiscal policy as also where state spending takes place, in the direction of encouraging manufacturing and giving a spurt to infrastructure. Particularly public expenditure in infrastructure is what we are going to concentrate on. Policy alone won't bring a change. These are areas we have to concentrate on. My views on moderating interest rates are known. I'm sure as the situation is changing, particularly when food inflation for months together was under control, the oil prices are at a reasonably low level. The Reserve Bank deals with the issue. They are a very responsible institution, and I'm quite certain they will take note of all these trends itself. I do hope that when these additional changes do come in weeks and months to come, we'll see a far better sentiment and we'll see far better results as far as the ground is concerned. Mr. Suvil Kumar, Dean, Chicago Booth School of Business, India.
Thank you, sir. I address my comment both to you, but also to the audience, which consists of quite a few large employers. Being in the education sector, I view the post-secondary education issues in India not just as those of supply, but that of demand. In particular, to be an assistant station master in the Indian Railways, you need a 3-year degree. It's hard to argue that the necessary skills for such a job cannot be verified without the need for a credential like a 3-year degree. If we were to view job requirements afresh, think about them anew, then we could provide upward mobility. Given the gross enrollment ratio of only about 18 to 20%, 82% of the population is prevented from even applying for these jobs. And so if job requirements were viewed from the perspective of necessary skills rather than credentials, this might allow significant upward mobility in India. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Jin Yong Kai, Chief Executive of the International Finance Corporation. He's here. Well, anybody else who would want to speak can just send a name on a slip of paper to me so that I'll accommodate them after the names I've already got. Mr. Deepak Parekh.
Mr. Finance Minister, one of the very laudable objectives of this government is affordable housing, housing for all. And we have given some dates where we would like to achieve housing for all. Now, ease of doing business, particularly getting approvals for starting a housing project in the state. I know it's a state subject, and the multiplicity of approvals required even if you're doing an affordable housing project. It's 40 to 50 approvals are required from different departments. Most of them are state, but even some central. How do we bring this as a single window, and how do we encourage developers and entrepreneurs who want to build housing to start housing construction in a faster manner, in a quicker manner, so we can see progress? This will quick start the economy, because housing has such a multiplier.
What would you suggest?
I would suggest that at least for affordable housing, you need one approval, and that one approval from the local authorities. It is their responsibility to get the approvals from the civil aviation, the water, the police, all the various, the sewage department, the fire department, hundreds of approvals. So I think if at least the BJP states, some of the progressive BJP states, if we can introduce this. The other thing I would like to suggest is, we scrapped the Urban Land Ceiling Act many years ago. Yet every housing project in states have to get a ULC approval. There is no act, but ULC department in Maharashtra and other states still exist. When old cases come up for hearing in courts, the judge does not listen to those, hear those, because he says there is no act. But we have to scrap these old cases, so more land which is blocked in litigation for years comes into the open where we can start construction. So antiquated laws have to be repealed, and pending cases in courts also have to be repealed in order to see some progress in this. Thank you.
Mr. Hamid Rashid Al Mohandi, Chief Executive Officer of the Riyadh Gas, Qatar. Is he here, please? Mr. R.K. Pachauri.
Thank you, Honorable Finance Minister. Let me first salute you for having brought in so much dynamism into economic decision making. I just want to follow up on what's been said by several distinguished speakers this morning. We really need to take a long-term view on some critical challenges that the world and indeed India are going to face. And I'd like to highlight the need for taking climate change seriously. There has to be a significant amount of attention and resources provided for adapting to the impacts of climate change. If I could just mention a couple of numbers, the average sea level rise in the last century has been 19 centimeters. And even if we are able to limit temperature increase to below 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, we will have a sea level rise of an additional 26 to 55 centimeters. This is just one example. So we need to adapt to that. The impacts on human health, impacts on agriculture, on water availability. I just wanted to draw your attention to that, sir. But more importantly, we also need to bring about a shift to cleaner and more renewable as well as low carbon sources of energy. And I just want to highlight one important fact. These have enormous co-benefits. One of the major co-benefits from such a strategy is higher energy security. This country has a serious problem over the next 15 to 20 years on the security of energy supply, and therefore we need to use energy more efficiently. We also need to move towards low carbon sources of energy that has global as well as national benefits. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pachauri. Mr. S.P. Shukla, President Mahindra Defense Group Strategy.
Thank you, Finance Minister. My question actually combines three elements. Today we heard Prime Minister speaking about Make in India. The setting was Vibrant Gujarat, and we had a seminar on defense. Really speaking, the three elements of governance need to come together. Union Defense Ministry, Union Finance Ministry, and the state government for Make in India pertaining to defense to function. I will just give 2 pointers. One, it's a single customer situation. What it means is that to make any business case, you need to have certainty or some probability of revenues going forward 10 years. That has implications for people to take decisions. And secondly, from manufacturing perspective, India has had a wonderful thought process on SEZ. A lot of work has happened. In fact, one of the first SEZ in the country was Mahindra's near Chennai. In defense, we need defense manufacturing zones. Now, normal concept of SEZ cannot be applied because customer is one and customer is domestic. So we cannot apply the concept as it exists today. But if defense manufacturing zones were created, it is a typical industry, aerospace and defense, which works on hub approach. If some states come forward and along with Union Ministry these are created, it will be an initiative which can facilitate and kickstart the whole process. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shukla. Is Shri Anil Ambani here? Shivaisi Deveshwar? Mr. David Farsh, CEO, Emerson Electric, United States. If he's here, could he just raise his hand? Jonas Stason, CEO, Eon SE, Germany.
We are working in the field of utilities, power production, gas trading. I just would propose a stronger cooperation in the renewables between India and countries like Germany with bad and good experiences, and a broad integration for the gas sourcing. I think some European companies can provide a lot of support to India and together could achieve more.
Any one from the audience, if he wants to, anyone amongst the CEOs wants to make a point? I have two gentlemen on the rear side. Please introduce yourself and then...
Thank you. My name is Victor Zonanana. I'm the principal of Global Health Strategies, an international healthcare consulting company. I'm asking about the Corporate Social Responsibility Act in India and the requirement that companies contribute to corporate social responsibility. Is that an initiative of the current government, the previous government? Do you see it unfolding as anticipated? And can you talk about the benefits and disadvantages of same?
Well, the statutory provisions regarding the corporate social responsibility in India have been recently legislated. We had a new Companies Act which was legislated by the Indian Parliament in 2013. It's no Indian secret that the Act was not particularly welcomed by most Indian corporates because of some provisions. So there are a large number of changes that the present government is proposing to make in them. But one of the good things in that Act was a statutory provision with regard to corporate social responsibility. There is a provision, section 135, which says that out of the profits that a corporate makes, 2% is to be ordinarily spent on defined purposes of which are the defined CSR purposes. Now, these purposes are not going to be just legitimizing whatever good things the corporates were doing earlier. In order to come within the scope of that statutory provision, there are some provisions which have been defined in the 7th schedule of the Act. And you have to pick up one of those activities and spend it on those activities. And I must say our initial experience is that most Indian corporates are now formulating and implementing strategies to effectively implement that mandate of law. By and large, the provision has been welcome. The companies have realized their social responsibilities. They are picking on projects. For instance, the Prime Minister of India has given a call for a cleanliness campaign in the country. It's called the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan. The cleanliness campaign has been included as a CSR purpose, and many companies are moving in that direction itself. So that's the position as far as Indian law is concerned. I saw somebody else in the last row there who wanted to make a point.
Mr. Piyush Gupta, the CEO of DBS Bank out of Singapore. I wanted to reflect on the Prime Minister's comment about moving on from look east to act east, and just suggest that as we think east, ASEAN is a particular area that is worth focusing attention on. 2015 is quite important because the ASEAN region comes together as a single economic community with a population of 600 million people and a GDP of $2.5 trillion. It has two big possibilities. One, a significant source of capital for India, and B, a substantial marketplace for the outputs of Make in India. In fact, it's important that Indian brands can work extremely well in ASEAN, a lot more than in other parts of the world. But the other big advantage is China is slowing. And so ASEAN does need an additional driver of growth to balance a slowing China. So this window is extremely useful over the next 2 or 3 years, but to actually bring it to fruition requires a substantial amount of focus, because the reality is that the industries and companies, the peoples of ASEAN, are wary of being able to negotiate the issues around India. And therefore, a particular focus, a single point window, etc., but a particular focus on marketing and selling to ASEAN and into ASEAN would be extremely productive.
Thank you. Mr. Kunal Bahal, the CEO of Snapdeal.com.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. So, e-commerce is at the confluence of Make in India and Digital India. Our company has about 100,000 merchants who sell, as well as created jobs directly and indirectly for about 100,000 people. But the challenge we face is that each state has different tax laws and different interpretation of tax laws. As a result, for a merchant who wants to sell a product from Gujarat to a consumer in Tamil Nadu or Kerala faces tremendous challenges. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we can resolve that, because that will increase entrepreneurship and commerce in general in the country. Thank you.
Well, this is a business of the current generation, and it's going to grow and grow. And therefore, this is a hard reality we are coming to terms with. Now, as far as different taxations in different parts of the country are concerned, this is one issue which has confronted us, and since 2006 we were struggling to find a solution. How do we convert the whole country into one common market? Now, that itself will enable a seamless transfer of goods. It will enable a seamless transfer of services. But yet there were a series of unanswered questions. We took it up in a big way ever since the new government took over. And I do believe that today there is almost a near consensus in India with regard to uniformity as far as taxation is concerned. Now, the GST architecture which has been designed at the moment is going to enable that. I've already, after consensus of both states, and some states which had some residuary questions, I'm speaking to the Chief Ministers directly myself. I'm getting a fairly encouraging response. I introduced the Constitution Amendment in the last session. I'm intending that in the coming budget session, the Constitution Amendment Bill should be passed. And thereafter, the three enabling ordinary legislations will have to be placed after the Constitution Amendment is ratified by more than half the states. That should happen in the course of the year. The IT backbone required for it is being worked out. We have a fairly ambitious target to go on stream from the 1st of April 2016, and I hope this doesn't get delayed. And once that were to happen, as far as goods are concerned and services are concerned, and you probably in e-commerce are a mix of both, will have uniformity as far as the central taxations are concerned, as far as the state taxes are concerned. There will be, with regard to state taxes, some initial hiccups. But I'm sure as the states realize, as they did in the case of the VAT earlier, that it's going to be a win-win situation where the volumes are going to grow, and therefore the revenues of each state is going to grow. And therefore they are going to subsequently, the changeover phase may be a year or 2 years, then work out more attractive deals so that they can have a better part of businesses like this. It's a great experiment, but let's hope we are able to maintain the timelines, because from 2006 till 2014 we didn't make much headway. Now we are making a considerable headway in this area. I have Mr. Vikram Sahni. Will you put his hand up, please? Vikramji.
Sir, at the outset, we want to congratulate the government for announcing the very vital measures, whether it's transparency in the coal sector, insurance. Otherwise, business community would have felt that the trailer of Achhe Din was good, but the movie was not box office. So it was very good and very timely. I've got one suggestion and one question. Question is that we have burgeoning amounts of food and fertilizer subsidies every year. But you will agree with us that there is everybody in the ministry, and we know there's a budgeted amount, we know this much is the subsidy. But unfortunately, the allocated budget is far less than the required subsidy. The allocated amount gets exhausted in November or December. Then come January, February, there's a vote on account, wait, and there's a large carryover of the subsidy. So we'll request your good selves that in the coming budget, either subsidies should be rationalized and the MRP or these things should be increased, or a sufficient allocation of the subsidies be made in the budget should the government feel that the prices cannot be increased. This is one. Second is, as the colleague was saying, I think it's a high time we should have a national offset policy, because India can use its buying leverage not only in defense but in the civil imports to use its buying leverage for promoting exports and have technology transfer. And I agree with the suggestion that we should have a national offset policy where a foreign seller is allowed to invest not only in defense but also in the other sectors like renewable and infrastructure. So this is our humble suggestion, to have a national offset policy. Thank you.
Mr. Wolfgang Renefeckel, Dean of the School of Public Policy.
Good evening, and thank you, and also congratulations on putting the Indian economy on this dynamic trajectory of growth and development. My question to you would be, what are the government's plans to train, educate, professionalize the public sector officials, public administrators, bureaucrats, policymakers, to accompany the private sector on this dynamic path towards growth? Thank you.
A very difficult question for me. You see, we have a very large number of well-trained people in the public sector. We are trying to ensure that with the kind of experience and the kind of volumes that they handle, they get a lot more freedom, a lot more autonomy in order to conduct their businesses. For instance, our banking sector, to a very large extent, is public sector. The present government's policy is to give them as much autonomy as is possible. The challenge before the public sector in India is not the fact that its executives are not well trained. The challenge is that in a competition with the private sector, there are inbuilt limitations of a public sector. The private sector can afford to act and err. It can even take a risk. It can have a hit and trial. In the case of public sector, they've been trained to be defensive. And the legal regime in which they function, this experimentation doesn't come to them normally. We've also had bad experiences where bona fide actions, which don't result eventually in being a success, lead to much higher and much more penal standards of accountability as far as public sector executives are concerned. So a lot of public sector executives have been telling us in the last few days, give me the same level playing field as is available, and the same legal regime as is available to a private sector. And that is something which we seriously have to introspect how to provide it to them. In fact, since you've raised the point, I can see some of the public sector CEOs here. I'm going to request one of them to more elaborately make this point. But before I do that, I have Mr. Jeremy Bird of the International Water Management Institute. And after that, would the chairperson of the State Bank likely to elaborate what I've been saying, because she's been loudly making this point to the Prime Minister and me.
Honourable Minister, first of all, thank you very much for this exciting session. And I'd like to pick up on the point that R.K. Pachari made about taking climate change seriously and to really welcome the solar irrigation mission, the solar mission here in India. And one particular emphasis on that is the investment in incentivizing solar irrigation pumps to replace pumping from fossil fuel generated electricity or from diesel fuel. But that also potentially comes with a risk. It comes with a risk that having free solar power will lead to even further over-abstraction of groundwater. And this is a sort of characteristic water, food, energy nexus example where potentially an intervention, positive intervention in one sector has negative implications elsewhere. So one of my colleagues, Dr. Tushar Shah, working with the Imitata program, has been suggesting that really we should be looking at also incentivizing farmers to look at solar power from these solar irrigation pumps as a solar cash crop. So any excess or surplus generation from these pumps can be fed back at a guaranteed buyback into the system. And this would then follow up on some of the preliminary sort of work being done in Karnataka under the Surya Rayata program. And this is, we'd certainly like to see this sort of looked at more comprehensively, and we're happy to partner with anybody who's interested in doing so. Thank you very much.
Mrs. Bhattacharya, if you'd like to take the floor.
So thank you for the opportunity, sir. Basically, if you look at Indian business, at this point of time, the public sector has about 73% of all banking transactions. And this is in spite of the fact that we have a sufficient amount of competition from the private sector. If you look at the public sector banks as such, while about 10 to 12 years back, I would say that their technology was not up to the mark, at this point of time, some of the best technology is employed by the public sector. One of the current trends, that is to go digital, it was in the public sector and it was in our bank, in fact, that the first all-digital branch of a bank was opened by us. Not only that, in the recent past, when the Prime Minister gave a call for financial inclusion in the Jan Dhan Yojana, as much as 100 million accounts have been opened by the public sector banks in a space of 4 months. And this has been done with all due diligence. All these accounts are on the system. They are getting operated upon. Most of these accounts have already been carded so that people can actually do cash out from various points. So I don't really think the public sector is lagging behind either in technology or in risk management or in having the right kind of products. But what really is holding the public sector back? If you look at India, the best of our talent goes to the IITs and the IIMs. These are supported by government public funds. But when it goes to recruitment, the public sector is not able to recruit a single person from the IITs and the IIMs. When I entered the bank, we had as our colleagues many people from the IITs. But we don't have them today. And the reason is, today the IITs and the IIMs, the students have campus recruitments. They have their letters of appointment a semester before their last semester. Public sector banks, on the other side, are not allowed to do campus recruitment because the courts state that any vacancy in a public sector bank has to be allowed to be competed by anybody and everybody. If you go to a particular campus, you prevent others who are not in that campus from competing for that one position. As a result, campus recruitment is barred for us. Similarly, today, for instance, we need good people in risk. Now, we would need them at a senior level. Now, if I'm trying to get a good person at a senior level, the kind of remuneration and compensation I would like to give them, I am not able to give because, again, in the public sector, the scales of pay are fixed and we cannot go beyond them. The same happens for our board. In the board, we need people with good domain knowledge of risk, of IT, of HR, of management. Again, good people are not all that common to find. They are few and far between. The public sector banks, they pay their directors a pittance. And therefore, it is difficult to source good people to sit on our boards. Those that come, they come out of a sense of service or because they really want to contribute, not because of the kind of remuneration that we are able to give. Now, you cannot always get people who will come for philanthropic reasons. Now, these are very real issues that the public sector banks face today. And these are things that need to be sorted out. Similarly, you have heard regarding non-performing assets and the fact that the public sector banks have more, whereas the private sector has less. First and foremost, the public sector banks have been supporting those areas of business which actually create a lot more employment. But not only that, when an asset becomes stressed, if you need to resolve the asset, the public sector has to go through a particular process, and that process is a very long-winded process. We need to put a reserve price. We need to do an auction. If that fails, I need to put another reserve price and again try an auction. If that fails, then at the third attempt, I can look at some kind of a bilateral deal. The private sector, on the other hand, can look at a bilateral deal at the first instance. So there are too many checks and balances in the public sector, which cause us to be not as efficient as we could be if these were resolved. And therefore, I think we have been making a lot of strident demands, requesting that we be put on the same platform as the private sector, so that we are able to perform better, that we are able to bring in better efficiency in our operations, and that all of our actions which are taken on commercial considerations should not be subject to so much of hindsight. Hindsight is always 20/20. As a finance minister rightly said, any decision that goes wrong, if it gets questioned, people will find it more convenient to not take decisions at all. So we need to ensure that we empower the public sector enough. And if that is done, I can assure you that there is enough talent in the public sector, that there is enough understanding of what needs to be done. They need to be unshackled. If they can be unshackled, surely things will improve. Thank you.
Well, that's a very forceful presentation of the public sector executive's point of view. Mr. Michael Greenstone, Professor of Economics and the Director, Energy Policy Institute at Chicago.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity, and congratulations on the day. So I just want to start with two observations. The first is that industries find environmental regulation very burdensome in India. It's difficult to comply with. The rules sometimes seem arbitrary on the one hand. And then the second observation is that the levels of air pollution in India are extraordinarily high, possibly even higher than China. And that leads to dramatic losses of life expectancy, increased sickness, things that hold back growth. So what I wanted to suggest is that there's a very rare opportunity for a policy twofer, which is that the embrace of market-based regulation in the environmental sector could produce both reductions in compliance costs that would increase growth and also clean the air and lead to healthier lives that also facilitates growth. So I wanted to hear your thoughts about possibilities for moving towards kind of 21st century market-based regulation.
21st century?
What I was calling 21st century market-based environmental regulation. Cap and trade, taxes.
We'll deal with the issue. Let me just go through 2-3 speakers. Ashish A. Mithani. Could he raise his hand, please?
I am a businessman from Gujarat, and my concern is about the renewable energy implementation program. This country has more than 85% of the power coming from fossil fuels, and more than 65% of this fossil fuel is imported fuel, which is raising a lot of concern on balance of payments. But for implementing renewable energy projects, we have multitudinous regulators, multitudinous agencies implementing, and there is hardly any synergy. Is there any aggressive program, because we are not adding more than 1 to 2% of renewable energy every year, despite there is a very, very aggressive need on energy security of this country, beyond the environment concern?
In the list which was given to me, Mr. Peter Coleman, Managing Director, Woodside Energy, Australia. Is he here? Ms. Preeta Reddy from Apollo Hospital. Mr. John Davies, Vice President, Global Intel Corporation.
Would Mr. Sunil Mittal want to make a point?
Thank you, Finance Minister. I know you are deeply engaged on one hand with the state of affairs of the country, but equally I'm sure you're 40 days away from the budget, which is one event where I think the entire business community, both in India and globally, are focused on. Without, of course, revealing anything in detail, could you give us a sense of how you're feeling? Do you have enough elbow room to experiment some bold reforms in the budget, some bold moves in the budget? Oil prices are down, spectrum auctions are going to go through, coal auctions are hopefully going to go through, the divestment program is moving, and equally you have demands of states and social programs. We would like to know from you if you believe you have some elbow room to experiment with lower taxes, some incentives to certain parts of industries, northeast parts of India.
Well, you see, a lot is expected normally from a union budget in India. Just now, Mr. Bikram Soni made a point about providing for all the subsidies of the year in the same year itself. Now, we've followed a system where tax refunds of the previous year are conveniently passed on to the next year. Fourth quarter subsidies, that's the point Mr. Soni made, are passed on to the next year. In addition to these two, one of the conditions precedent for implementation of the goods and services tax was payment of the past CST compensation. So that was not provided for. So in the current year, I have inherited all three of them. So besides policy legacy issues, I also had the legacy of unpaid bills. Now I had a very challenging option, which was to make a very candid disclosure and say the fiscal deficit is much higher than what it looks. But then I decided to follow the conventional discipline, accepted that figure, and I'm trying to work within the framework of that figure. Now there are only two ways of correcting the deficit. Either I collect more or I spend less. As far as divestment is concerned, we have a fairly ambitious program, and literally within the next few days you'll hear a lot more about it. Until 31st March, it's going to be fairly ambitious. In your own sector, we are hoping to get some revenue out of the spectrum sale itself. I am endeavoring in this year to stay on with the fiscal deficit target, which may involve cutting down a little expenditure. In terms of direct tax collections, we are broadly on track, minus only the tax refunds which we had to pay. Indirect, because manufacturing last 2 years was low, it hasn't significantly picked up, and therefore this has an impact on excise. That's a challenge for me. To a union budget, the lowering of the oil prices comes as a good news, but it's a mixed bag. It's good news in terms of your subsidy bills come down. The states indirectly suffer because all of them have an ad valorem duty on petrol and oil. So their revenues go down. I am very enthused by the fact that inflation has come down, so hopefully the interest rates will come down. But our tax buoyancy is dependent on the notional GDP, which is actual GDP plus inflation. So tax buoyancy also comes down to that extent. Now, given those constraints, we'll have a much higher growth rate than last year. We'll hopefully have higher revenues than last year. But in the next year, if I look at the projections, they look much better than the current year itself. So revenues will be better, and I will have a lot of elbow room. We intend facilitating the states to a large extent. This Niti Aayog, the substitute body, the alternative body to the Planning Commission, one of the objects of the Prime Minister was that the control and command structure goes down. The central government in India had 130 schemes, centrally sponsored schemes, which has now become 67. So Gujarat is to implement the same scheme as Tripura is to implement. Now Manrega has not many takers in Gujarat. It doesn't have many takers in Punjab. It may have a lot more takers in Madhya Pradesh or in Bihar. So you can't have a uniform scheme for the whole country. So one of the objects is after this that the states must be empowered more. The number of these schemes hopefully should come down, and therefore states should have better, there'll be more decentralization of funds. We are examining the report of the Finance Commission itself, and depending on what decision we take, that will have to be implemented. Now, in terms of policy and bold initiatives, as you call it, I think the present government has proved its credentials. It's willing to take the bold steps. There are no constraints within the government. There are not even hindering factors outside the government. The only factor that prevents us at time is how do you get it approved by the upper house? But then we have a constitutional mechanism. You get it approved by the lower house, and if it doesn't get cleared, by the lower house you have a joint session. Hopefully we won't have to resort frequently to that. But I think whatever steps are required, which includes clearing up a lot of problems of the past, we are quite willing to take them on. I had indicated in the response to Mr. Ambani's brief comment that the basic thrust in the days to come will have to be investment, infrastructure and manufacturing. The other steps can keep on coming. We are in a position to take effective steps as and when required. I don't think that will be a serious problem. But whatever steps in terms of fiscal policy, in terms of political decision making, in terms of nudging the states, in terms of hand-holding to the private sector is concerned, these are the three areas we have to concentrate on if we have to get back to 6.5% next year, and hopefully in that 7-8% league the year after that. That's the target that we are aiming at. Well, any more responses? I'll just read out some of the other names that I have. Mr. Vittorio Colau, Chief Executive Officer of Vodafone.
Good evening. My idea is really a little bit linked to the issue of growth and e-commerce and opportunities for the future, and really to digital India. So I go back to London really personally enthusiastic about digital India, and as a company very supportive, because for the first time I hear growth, inclusion and good governance under one banner, and the banner is connectivity, and connectivity of the unconnected with everybody else. So here is my crazy suggestion, Mr. Minister. Can you turbocharge this idea? Can you think beyond what other countries are thinking today? In Europe, in the US, we are talking 3G, 4G, these things. Is there a case, given the population of India, given the need to connect the unconnected, to start thinking all Gs, to start thinking total connection? Is this a possibility in this country, which is huge in terms of potential, to start thinking of auctioning all spectrum, which is our raw material, and really have an ambition that in 5 years' time, first of all, you will get a big check from us, a much bigger check, which I think also out the problem of Sunil, but also you will give to technology investors of the world and the innovators, like the company that spoke before, the possibility to really give to every young, every woman, every small business a platform to thrive on and to have not just the best growing economy, but the best growing digital economy in the world.
Thank you. Well, I think India is willing to think out of the box. And the way in the last 2 decades we've expanded in the sector that you are referring to, if fresh ideas, fresh challenges are thrown up, today's India is quite willing to accept them. I always used to believe 20 years ago that reforms in a developing economy are far more challenging than in a developed economy. Because in a developing economy, there's a very large section which hasn't tasted success as yet. But I now find that the popular support behind the very idea of change, progress, reform in India, it has a huge amount of support. In fact, even when we are taking a lot of steps, an occasional comment which comes is, anybody who tries to deflect or divert the agenda from reforms and growth, from economic agendas, the adverse comment is, can't we stop these people and just concentrate on the roadmap that we have ahead of us? So your suggestion is very well taken. I have Marcos Hottenrott from the Morgan Stanley Infrastructure. Is he here? Mr. Richard Rickey, Chief Executive from the KPMG. Mr. Martin Westeler from Integrated Gas Shell, Netherlands. I have a request from Mr. Dilip Mehta from the floor. He wanted to make a point. He says he's one of the survivors of the 26/11 attack in Mumbai.
Good evening, sir. Thank you very much for giving the opportunity. I do appreciate. Yes, I am one of the fortunate survivors of 26/11 attack, about which Honorable Prime Minister spoke in the initial stage of his wonderful presentation. Sir, I am told by the international consultants and about the possibility of implementation of the Ram Pradhan committee report, the possibilities of implementing, sir, in the union budget 40 days from now. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Amitabh Banerjee, Professor of Economics, MIT, is here.
Your Excellency, Maarten Wetzelaar here at the back of the room, at the other end. Yes.
Please speak up.
Thank you. I have a question about the energy mix of India. Today already, India faces an energy shortage in terms of electricity for its people and power for its industry. And if your very aggressive economic plans of 6 to 8% growth indeed come about in the coming years, that deficit might well grow. So energy supply in India will need to grow very fast. But at the same time, you're keen to tackle climate change and air pollution. So my colleagues in the room and UN Secretary have rightly pointed out that growth of renewables energy in India will be an important response to that. But renewables cannot fill that gap alone. And in any case, if they become material, need to cooperate with other sources of energy. Now, natural gas is the cleanest burning fossil fuel that could fill that gap. and still mitigate climate change and air pollution. But India is a very small user of natural gas. It is less than 10% in its energy mix, much less than the 25% that we see in Europe or the US or in many big Asian economies. Now, Gujarat was in the same position 15 years ago, and ever since Gujarat's journey began, Gujarat has become a major user of natural gas, today up to 25%. Do you think that in terms of energy mix, Gujarat could also in that area set the example for India?
Well, thank you. I think the way you put the question, you've substantially answered it. Is Professor Ashish Nanda from the IIM India Director?
I'm here, but Professor Banerjee was before me from MIT.
First Professor Banerjee and then you.
Thank you. I had a question sort of echoed in many of the other questions, which is, I think when the government